The men of Company F had heard rumors about a new German contraption, some sort of awkward-looking shoulder-fired rocket tube the GIs were already mocking as the stovepipe. They knew it as the Panzerschreck, though many of them still confused it with the older Panzerfaust. The veterans shrugged it off as another enemy weapon that would end up misfiring or blowing up in the user's face. Reports from the rear suggested it was clumsy, heavy, and tended to belch smoke like a steam locomotive. Nothing about it sounded particularly threatening. On a fog-heavy December morning in 1944, during the opening phase of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge, the company advanced through a Belgian hamlet whose stone walls still trembled from artillery the night before. Sergeant Michael Mick Donnelly, a former iron worker from Pittsburgh, felt the familiar tension crawling up his spine. He didn't trust quiet villages. They had a way of holding shadows that breathed. The first sign that something was wrong was the silence after a distant armored engine idle. Tanks usually brought noise, metal clatter, shouted commands, clanking treads. But here there was only the cold breath of winter. Donnelly raised his hand, signaling the platoon to slow. Up ahead, Private Hawkins whispered, "Jerry Armour?" Donnelly shook his head. "No. Something smaller." A moment later they saw two German infantrymen dart between barn doors, moving with hurried precision. One carried the unmistakable long tube on his shoulder, nearly as tall as he was. From a distance it looked too cumbersome to be useful, almost ridiculous. The GIs had laughed at photos of it in briefings. But before Donnelly could voice an order, a violent flash erupted from the launcher's muzzle, lighting the alleyway with a sudden burst of fire. The rocket streaked across the open space with terrifying speed, disappearing beneath the squad's half-track. The explosion that followed seemed to lift the vehicle off its axles before slamming it back down in a shower of metal shards and screaming men. The concussive shock punched Donnelly in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The launcher's reputation for clumsiness vanished instantly in the minds of the witnesses. Nothing about that blast felt crude. Nothing about the accuracy seemed accidental. Smoke drifted in thick gray sheets as German voices echoed from the alleyway, short, sharp, confident. Another flash came, and another rocket hissed past, forcing the Americans into desperate cover among broken stone walls. Donnelly realized with grim clarity that they had underestimated. American intelligence officers had scribbled dismissive remarks in reports: unwieldy, excessively smoky, impractical for mobile infantry. Yet as the days unfolded, Company F learned the truth behind the weapon's deceptive reputation. Recovered fragments from a destroyed half-track revealed the Panzerschreck's craftsmanship. It was not elegant, no polished steel or sleek engineering, but it was brutally efficient. A simple steel tube roughly 1.6 meters long, fitted with rudimentary sights and a protective shield added in later models. The shield, battered and scorched, looked crude, but it served its purpose, protecting the operator from the fierce backblast of the 88mm rocket. What made the launcher deadly wasn't aesthetic precision but purposeful design. The Germans had studied captured American bazookas early in the war, scaling up the concept into something heavier, more powerful, and far more devastating. The larger projectile delivered armor penetration that frightened even Shermans, whose crews were already haunted by the silhouette of Tiger tanks. In a barn they secured after a prolonged firefight, the GIs discovered a discarded launcher. Donnelly and Lieutenant Sanders approached it cautiously, as though it might ignite at the touch. "Looks like it was welded by a blind man," Sanders muttered. Donnelly nodded. "But it works." They examined the heat-scored tube, noting the blackened streaks around the shield and the rough texture of its grips. The thing felt improvised, almost primitive, yet every mark carried evidence of battlefield use. Nearby, a crate of unused rockets confirmed their suspicions. Each warhead was a deadly commitment to simplicity, weight, and destructive force. Sanders flipped through the captured documents found near the launcher. Diagrams, firing arcs, training notes written in hurried German script. "They don't need finery," he said quietly. "Just something that kills a tank." The truth hit the lieutenant harder than he expected. American troops had mocked the clumsy design, yet it excelled in real combat scenarios, especially in villages, forests, and tight quarters where armor couldn't maneuver well. The weapon didn't need elegance. It needed only an enemy within 150 meters. Donnelly thought back to the men they had lost that morning. The stovepipe no longer seemed laughable. It was a blunt reminder that underestimating the enemy's ingenuity could cost them dearly. And though the GIs still cracked jokes to ease their nerves, the tone had changed. Respect, born from fear, now edged every mention of the German launcher. By late afternoon, the American line had shifted south toward a narrow road that cut through a frozen clearing. Snow-covered fir trees pressed in from both sides, their branches weighed down under icy armor. The road was the only viable route for resupply, and both sides knew it. Donnelly's platoon took defensive positions along the ditch, their breath fogging in the bitter air. The horizon glowed faintly orange, fire still burning from earlier engagements. The crack of rifles echoed intermittently, distant but unsettling. The quiet broke when a Sherman tank rumbled toward them, its engine grumbling like a wounded animal. The tank commander, a tall, weary corporal, leaned out of the hatch. "Heard you boys had a run-in with a new toy of theirs," he said. Donnelly exhaled sharply. "Toy? Try an angry dragon." The tank crew laughed, but the fear behind their eyes betrayed them. Minutes later, the first rocket shrieked across the clearing. It moved almost gracefully, a dark streak with a fiery tail, before striking the Sherman's glassy plate. The blast ripped a molten crater into the armor, rocking the tank backward. Steam, smoke, and screams burst from the hatch simultaneously. The scene shattered the illusion that armor meant safety. The giant machine, moments earlier a symbol of American strength, now looked fragile, its steel torn open by something fired from a man's shoulder. Chaos rippled down the line. German infantry emerged from forest shadows like wraiths, their silhouettes jerking forward between trees. Some carried rifles, others hefted the unmistakable long tubes. Each shot lit the dusk with a predatory glow. Donnelly shouted orders, but the world had devolved into smoke, snow, and shrapnel. Hawkins scrambled to drag the tank commander out of the burning turret, his gloves smoldering as he pulled. The corporal's face was charred, his breath shallow and ragged, yet he lived. Machine gun fire thundered as the Americans fought to hold the road, but every attempt to push forward was met with another rocket streaking from the treeline. The Germans knew how to use the weapon's strengths: ambush, concealment, close-range power. Each launch felt inevitable, unstoppable. When night finally swallowed the battlefield, the Americans had held the road, but at a cost that weighed heavy on every heart. They no longer doubted the launcher's lethality. The Germans had turned their clumsy tool into a psychological weapon as well as a physical one. And the echoes of those rockets haunted the platoon long after the firing ceased. 2 days passed under relentless pressure. The December cold carved itself into every joint, every breath. Frost clung to the edges of helmets like brittle lace, and ammunition froze to rifle bolts if handled too slowly. But it wasn't the cold that gnawed at morale, it was the knowledge that somewhere hidden behind stone walls or snowy ridges, a German rocketeer could be aiming at them. Donnelly's platoon had been assigned to clear a cluster of abandoned farmhouses believed to conceal Panzerschreck teams. Intelligence suggested the Germans were cycling ambush squads through these structures, firing a few rockets before retreating deeper into the forest. Inside the first farmhouse, the Americans found signs of recent occupation: bread crusts, muddy boot prints, tobacco smoke clinging to the rafters. A spent rocket tube lay across a table like a venomous snake that had already struck. Private Hawkins examined it carefully. "It's heavy," he muttered. "How the hell do they run with this thing?" Donnelly answered quietly. "Fear makes a man fast. So does desperation." As they advanced toward the second building, a barn with its doors half buried in snow, a sudden blast tore through the wall beside them. The explosion flung Donnelly to the ground, his ears ringing violently. Through the haze, he saw a German rocketeer retreating behind a crumbling stone fence, smoke curling from his launcher. Hawkins fired but missed. The enemy soldier had already vanished. Rage burned through the platoon. They stormed the barn, sweeping through shadows and broken beams, expecting a trap. Instead, they found the body of a young German soldier, likely no older than 19, crumpled beside an ammunition crate. His gloves were scorched, his face pale and peaceful as though sleep had claimed him before death. Lieutenant Sanders knelt beside the body. "Backblast injury," he murmured. "Happens to them too." The realization struck everyone. The Germans weren't wielding the weapon without risk. The same fierce blast that made the Panzerschreck so destructive also made it dangerous to fire. Its operators were gambling their lives with every rocket. The platoon gathered in heavy silence before moving out. The war had taught them many things, but now it taught them something new. Respect for the enemy did not diminish hatred. It complicated it. Made it heavier. More human. The snow fell harder as they marched, blurring the lines between victory, survival, and guilt. By February, when the American offensive pushed the Germans back toward the Rhine, the Panzerschreck's presence gradually faded. Supply shortages and collapsing defensive lines forced the enemy to abandon many launchers in fields and barns. Yet the psychological imprint the weapon left on Allied troops lingered long after the rockets stopped flying. Donnelly walked alone one morning through an abandoned German encampment. He found a final launcher lying against a broken cart, snow piling around its tube like a burial mound. He lifted it, feeling the cold metal bite his palms. It weighed less than the fear it had inspired. Nearby, a diary lay half buried in frozen mud. Donnelly picked it up, brushing away frost. The entries were simple, mundane details of rations, weather, missing comrades. But one line stood out: "The launcher is crude, but it gives us a chance." A chance. That was the heart of it. In a war increasingly dominated by machinery and firepower, the Panzerschreck offered ordinary infantrymen a way to strike at giants. It was the equalizer of the desperate, the weapon of those pushed to the edge. Donnelly closed the diary and stood in the quiet morning air. He thought of the tank crews who had died, of Hawkins who had taken shrapnel to the leg, of the German boy in the barn, of the soldiers on both sides who had faced death through the smoke of the same weapon fired in opposite directions. War made no room for sentiment, yet here he was, feeling something close to understanding. Not forgiveness, never that, but recognition. The clumsy-looking stovepipe, mocked for its crude design, had shaped the battlefield in ways no one had predicted. Its simplicity was its brilliance, its power, its curse. When Donnelly finally set the launcher down, he felt an unexpected relief wash through him. He walked back toward his unit, the last traces of winter sun glinting off snow. The war was not over, but this chapter, the chapter of rockets streaking from forest shadows, felt closed. Yet he knew its lessons would outlive the weapon itself. Never underestimate your enemy, never assume clumsiness means weakness, and never forget that behind every tool of war, there is a human hand, trembling, determined, or afraid.